welcome to our webinar on Class Q and barn conversions. So I'm joined today by Sally Moore, Hannah Moore and Angela Cantrell, all who are senior planning consultants within the Rural Planning Co. So I'll just give you a bit of an introduction. So who are we? The Rural Planning Co. is a team of planning consultants, and we specialise in strategic solutions for the agricultural and rural sectors. Within the team, we've got a lot of agricultural specialists and rural specialists. A lot of us have been to Harper Adams, and we really are good on that side of the business. So we cover agricultural, residential, rural business and equestrian planning. We are based now in Ombersley in Worcestershire. We have recently moved from Hannah's family farm in Hartlebury, so just down the road, but we cover planning projects across all of England. And if you'd like to know a bit more about our business, a great place to start is our website. So if you visited that website that you can see there, the ruralplanningco.co.uk, you can find case studies, a resources hub, lots about our planning approvals and planning news. So without further ado, what I'm going to do now is pass you over to Sally Moore, who is going to talk about what Class Q is.
There we go. Thanks, Nicola. Morning, everyone. I'm Sally. Thank you for joining us. I'm going to run through a bit of a background and summary of what Class Q is, and then Hannah's going to talk us through how Class Q can be used really effectively, and Angela is then going to talk through some examples for us. So I'm going to start off with a boring bit, but I do promise to keep it brief, a bit of an overview of how the English planning system works and what permitted development rights actually are. So the planning system controls development, which includes operational development, i.e. physical works, and changes of use of land and buildings, and almost all development requires permission before it's allowed to be carried out. But the government doesn't want to be dealing with applications for every tiny alteration anyone makes, so they set out a chunky piece of legislation called the General Permitted Development Order, which sets out that certain types of development are already permitted. If your proposal completely meets the criteria in that legislation, then it doesn't need a further planning permission as such, although quite often there is still a process of prior notification to the council that has to be followed. So if permitted development or PD rights don't apply, full planning permission is needed, which in a nutshell requires a submission to your local council, which they will then assess against planning policy and review the technical and practical considerations of whether before deciding whether to grant you permission or not. Okay. Now, Class Q was first introduced in 2014. It's a class within that General Permitted Development Order, and in a way it was quite shocking to planners at the time because it made the whole system for barn conversions much more open and flexible than it had been before. As a headline, Class Q grants the change of use of a building and necessary building works associated with that. The legislation has evolved over the years with notable changes in 2024, which I'll come on to, and various case laws also fine-tuned how it's interpreted. But Class Q can apply to any type of building. The starting point before going into the more detailed criteria is whether the building as it stands is structurally sound and capable of being converted without excessive works, i.e. rebuilding it altogether. This can give a huge opportunity to take an existing agricultural building and turn it into something much more exciting and potentially valuable. The key thing to remember is it's all about the criteria. So failing on any one of the criteria makes the whole development ineligible. Some of those criteria are quite clear and objective. For example, is the floor area within the relevant threshold? But others can be much more open to interpretation, and I'll come on to some of those in a moment. Now, I'm going to work backwards a little bit here by starting off with what's changed recently for those of you that might already be familiar with the general gist of Class Q. In 2024, the government updated the legislation, and the key headlines are size of dwellings is reduced to no more than 150 square metres per dwelling, but you can have up to 10 dwellings in total on the farm and up to 1,000 square metres, which is more than you could have before. If the building was in place before 2023, then it doesn't need to have been up for any set length of time before that, so long as the farm is well established. A broader range of uses of buildings now qualify. Rear extensions of up to 4 metres can be added in certain circumstances, and the site has to have a suitable existing access. The images at the bottom here show a building which we got permission for as a farm shed under full planning in 2017. It was constructed in 2022 and then was then eligible for conversion under Class Q, which we successfully achieved in 2025. So if you've looked at Q before and not been eligible, or even applied and been refused before, it might well be worth revisiting since these changes have come in. Now, qualifying use is one of those big changes. Buildings are eligible now so long as they were in place in July 2023. Anything put up after that date needs to be in for 10 years before it will qualify. And there's 3 specific scenarios of building which can now qualify. The first is an agricultural building on an active trading well-established farm. The second is a building on an active trading farm, but not necessarily in agricultural use. And the third is a former agricultural building, which is no longer part of a farm, but which was last used for agriculture. Now, for well-established buildings and farms, these points are relatively straightforward. But if the farm or the building circumstances have changed more recently, for example, the use of the building or the trading status of the farm, perhaps a change in ownership, tread carefully, make sure you get the site reviewed on a case-by-case basis. Those dates are quite strict and it's not always that simple to understand. So just get it checked out if you're not sure on that point. Now, moving on to one of the big subjective criteria, conversion works. So this isn't a 2024 change, but the extent of works which can be done under Class Q is one of the biggest issues and the biggest reasons that Class Q applications fail. Building works which are reasonably necessary are allowed, but the crux is that the overall development still needs to be a conversion, not a rebuild. And getting the building assessed by a structural surveyor in the first instance is a good starting point. It needs to be sound, capable of taking any additional loading from the conversion, but you also need to be looking at retaining as much as possible of the existing material of the building. The picture here, a roof on legs, it might have qualified under Class Q when that first came out in 2014. So you may well even see examples of permissions that have gone through on buildings like this, but it would fail now due to the case law that's happened in the meantime, as there simply isn't enough material there to convert. That would be rebuilding it. Internal works are fine, however. So internal walls, concrete floors, works to install a mezzanine floor, stud work, insulation, and things like that can all be doable through a Class Q proposal. Now, the key cans and can'ts then of what you can and can't do under the Class Q. You can have up to 150 square metres per dwelling, have up to 10 dwellings per unit and 1,000 square metres in total. You can install windows, doors, roofs, cladding, insulation, walls, etc. The crux being not all at the same time. You can extend to the rear on existing hard standing up to 4 metres in some circumstances. You can add external insulation and cladding because you're now allowed a protrusion of up to 200 millimetres on the outside of the building, which is that's a new change under the new rules as well since 2024. You can take up to 3 years to complete the build, but no longer, and that's quite a hard line. So you can't kind of start and then it's implemented. You have to complete within 3 years. In most circumstances, there aren't occupancy restrictions. Technically, there is an allowance within the legislation for a council to put on an occupancy restriction, so it's not 100% of the time, but generally that building can be occupied by someone unconnected to the farm, or you could use it as a holiday let. And the Class Q applies whether or not buildings are in use or empty. There's no need to prove viability or need or disuse or anything like that. And it also doesn't matter whether it's owner occupied or tenanted, so long as the right permissions are in place from owners and tenants. You can't, however, and apologies if I've got the apostrophe in the wrong place here, I tried to find out where it should be and got very conflicting advice on that. You can't cross over with agricultural permitted development rights. So you can't use the same legislation to put up or alter agricultural buildings and then convert sheds within a 10-year period. So it works both ways. You can't do a Class Q and then a permitted development application for a new shed, or a new shed and then a Class Q within 10 years of each other. You can't do works in advance of the permission. You have to apply for prior approval first. You can't rebuild. It has to be a genuine conversion. You can't have a curtilage, i.e. kind of garden and parking area that's any larger than the footprint of the building. You can't extend dimensions beyond that 200 millimetre protrusion or the allowed 4 metre extension that I've mentioned. So you can't have a chimney flue or something like that. The Class Q legislation just does not allow it. You can't go off plan. So the crux with PD applications is you have to complete as per the plans and the details that you submitted for your prior approval. If you don't, then you actually can risk not having a permission at all, although you can sometimes vary the approved plan in some circumstances. Class Q doesn't override other conditions. So if there's a condition stating your building is only to be used for agriculture, then that needs sorting out before you can get Class Q on the building. You can't use it on listed buildings, in conservation areas, national parks, national landscapes, scheduled monuments, SSSI, safety hazard areas, safety hazard areas are not very easy to understand or find out where they are, but if you're near a big gas pipeline, then that's a red flag. I should have put in the can section, you can have Class Qs in Greenbelt, which is quite a restrictive planning designation where other things are not allowed, but Class Q is fine in the Greenbelt. You can't use Class Q if the existing building isn't lawful. So if it was put up without permission in the first place, you need to get the right kind of paperwork, get a certificate of lawfulness in place before you can then look at a Class Q on that as well. You submit your application to the council for prior approval assessment, and they will review all of those criteria, and they'll look at the extent of works you're going to do, whether it's appropriate from a transport and highways perspective, whether there's going to be any noise, contamination, flood risk issues. Is the site kind of sensible and practical, i.e. not right next to cattle sheds or slurry pits and not on the top of a hill? They look at the design and make sure that it meets all the criteria for space allowances and natural light and access. Protected species isn't a Class Q criteria, but they do have to take into consideration other legislation. So if the building's likely to have potential for bat roosts or something, then you've got to get an eco survey to cover that off. And the council have 56 days to come back to you. If they don't come back to you within that 56 days, it's called a deemed approval, so they can't technically object to the application, but the onus is still on the applicant to make sure that your development does comply with the Class Q criteria, regardless of whether the council have come back to you or not. So it doesn't necessarily mean you're okay to crack on. It's always worth getting a piece of paper from the council that says they're happy with it, even if they're after their 56-day timeframe. Very briefly, I'll also look at a quick comparison between Class Q and full planning. So Class Q, in theory, is cheaper than full planning. It's definitely quicker under that 56-day route. It does remove reliance on local policy, although there is still some element of kind of local interpretation of the rules in some councils which are more favourable to Class Q than others. It applies to the broad range of building types, and Class Q can be really good for giving you a fallback, particularly on modern buildings, which you can use then as a stepping stone or to help you get a strategy in place for what else you might want to do on the farm further down the line. But the key failing of Class Q is that criteria basis. If you fail one, you fail them all. There's no room for kind of negotiation or discussion in there. If you look at full planning, however, that's where planning policies come into play. A planning officer will assess the proposal. If there's more scope for design alterations or reinstatement of traditional features and things like that, so it can be more suitable for traditional buildings, which councils kind of prefer to convert generally. The key advantage of full planning generally is that you only have to implement within a set time period rather than complete, which is in big contrast with the Class Q. Criteria basis is less strict, although quite often you might have to prove that a building is disused or otherwise unviable for alternative uses like holiday lets or things like that. So Class Q and full planning can work alongside each other. It's not kind of you're either eligible only for one or the other. You might be eligible for both, and it's up to you to kind of pick and choose what works best for your circumstances. So now we know what Class Q is and a quick rattle stop through of how it works. I will hand over to Hannah to run through how to best use it.
Morning, everybody. I'm Hannah Mole. Myself, Sally and Angela and some of the other members of the team, we do loads and loads of Class Qs. So we hope that we are able to share some useful experience with you. I'm going to cover how to use Class Q to best advantage. And there might be a few points of contention in here. So this is slightly my views on things. Obviously, we've been doing it for a long time and are pretty well experienced in it, but other planners might do things slightly differently. So this is our take on how to approach Class Qs and use it strategically. So the first thing that I always sort of suggest that we start with, and I suppose if we're going out to see clients, this is our first question, is what are you using your Class Q for? What do you want to do with it? And why are you thinking of doing a Class Q? Obviously, there's different outputs of what a Class Q can do. And depending on what you're hoping to do with that building will depend on how we approach the Class Q in the first place. So, and I'll talk through those now, but yes, be really clear about your objectives. And whether it's us or other planning consultants or architects, communicate your objective with them, because hopefully anybody worth their salt, it will reflect in how you design and approach the class Q in the first place. So the types of scenarios that we do class Qs for, the first one is where it is for yourself or for a family member to live in. So obviously at that point, we're looking at things like optimizing it for what you want. So what your design is, what your personal tastes are. Are we talking about whether we need to look at privacy, the enjoyment, the size? And then actually we also need to look at budget. What's your budget to build it? So the second reason that we do class Qs is where people get the planning and then they look to sell it as a plot. And that's obviously to get capital out of the site, capital that they can go and do other stuff with, whether it's reinvesting or, jet off to the Bahamas or something. But if we're looking to sell the plots, obviously the objective there in mind and how we design the class Q is to get the best value for the plot. And similarly, if you were going to build it out as a project and develop it yourself and sell the finished house, we're looking at best end value. So that's sometimes quite a different thing to whether you're building it for yourself. And then the other thing that we do class Qs for quite regularly is for people that want to build it out and then have it as a rental income of some description. Now, people do that for either long-term rental incomes or they can do it as a holiday let. And really at that point, we're designing the class Q for best return on investment. So you may not be, it may not have quite the same design input as one of those other options. So trying to assess, and in some sites, there may be a combination of these as well. So trying to assess and be really clear about your objectives from the start, then communicate that with us. And we can obviously help tease that out and look at this with you. But starting from this helps us design and depending on what it is, but maximize the value of your site or optimize the value. Sally has already mentioned class Q is really an amazing opportunity. I'm a huge fan of class Q because it helps us get residential permission where you would never otherwise really get planning permission. In the open countryside, generally speaking, computer says no. Planning policy says, you say I want to build a house in this rural location, unless it's something like a rural workers dwelling, generally speaking, the answer is going to be no. So class Q gives you the opportunity to get permission for something that we wouldn't ordinarily get. So our approach with that in mind is generally with your class Q is not to be too clever or overly ambitious at the start. My view is that you get the class Q banked and we can change it, we can tweak it through either amendments or other applications as we go through. But don't try to be too ambitious at the first stage. You really want to just bank it, then we can fiddle with it afterwards. And quite often we use class Q very commonly as a strategic stepping stone to getting other things or getting what you want. You might not get it all in one application and it might not all be within the class Q. Let your planning consultant guide you as to what's achievable either at the first stage or second or even third stage, but it is a process. So it might not be ta-da in your first application. So just building on that, for example, and I'm going to talk about it, a little bit later, where we use class Q as a stepping stone. So we get permission for the change of use of the agricultural building. And then in quite a lot of instances, we do what's called a class Q supersede, which is we use the class Q as the fallback position, and then we make a planning application for new builds in its place. And I'm going to talk about that in a moment, but this is just one quick example to show you. So this is a site of ours down in the southeast, so it's pretty high value area. There was about 3 buildings on this one site, and we got all of them changed into class Qs. I think it was either 5 or 6 dwellings. It was in the green belt, very rare to get new build dwellings in this location, and because it's the southeast, it's down in Kent, worth a lot of money. And this is what we've managed to change this into. So that building was one of 3 buildings, and now we're just about to submit this scheme and this is with a view. Their objective was to sell this as plots. So we're looking to maximise the value of the end dwellings in order to maximise the value of the plots. So we're thinking, what's a developer going to want to build? What's going to be highest value in that location? Therefore, what do the plots need to look like to get the most amount of developers interested in buying this site. So I really would urge you, in terms of kind of getting your class Q right, this is not something where you should be submitting an application and hoping for the best. It's a really, really valuable asset. It's a great opportunity. As Sally said in her section, there's an awful lot of the criteria is split up into objective and subjective. Certainly with your objective criteria, is it in an A, O, and B? Yes or no? Is it a listed building? Yes or no? Those things you should categorically know before you submit this application. They should be definitively yes or no. We've got those objective criteria nailed. Some of these subjective criteria are a little bit more difficult, and we can all have a slightly different view as to whether something meets it or not. But again, if you're either doing your own research or working with a planning consultant that's experienced in class Qs, you should be quite down, you should be able to get quite a long way down the road of, yeah, we're 90% sure we can, you know, make sure that this meets these subjective criteria here. So don't send anything into the local planning authority without being, you know, sure what you have and haven't said meets the criteria. You know, I've seen applications go in and, you know, something that was supposed to be an agricultural building and somebody has inadvertently said, yes, we stored our sofas in there for the last 3 years, or we've had horses in there for 2 years, or, and it just doesn't need to have been said. But once it was said, you can't unsay it. So don't gamble with that opportunity or do it half-hearted. You know, make sure that you get it right first time. And if that means that you have to invest time and or money into doing it, this site is worth a lot of money, and it was worth them investing the money in doing the process correctly all the way through. So my next couple of slides is going to be about presentation of the class Q, and there is a little bit of skill involved in this. So it's about how you present the building and the site. You know, so a planning officer is going to be coming out and they're going to be making an assessment of your class Q. So you know, does it look how they're expecting it to look? And the second thing is actually the documents that you're submitting, what makes a good application. So as Sally alluded to, and I'm not going to go into any more detail here, you've got to decide which of the qualifying agricultural criteria or qualifying criteria you are going to depend your or base your application on. If, for example, you're saying this is an agricultural building on an established agricultural unit, you need to make sure that to a fresh pair of planning officer eyes, it looks like an agricultural building. So if you've got to have a tidy up before the application is submitted and the planning officer comes out, and sometimes that means quite hard work. You know, you've got to get stuff out and you've got to move it around and you've got to, and it's not just the inside, you know, it's not just whether there's stables in there or, you know, other thing like domestic storage, whatever, you know, it could just be from around the outside. So this site, for example, had got some caravan storage, there were some horses in the next door field. Does this feel like an agricultural unit or not? And if it doesn't, and that's what you're basing your application on, then you need to do some, you know, some prep work and make sure that when a planning officer comes out, it looks, smells and feels like a farm. Covered the first one, structure. So Sally again said the most important thing about a class Q is making sure that this building, this existing building, can be converted. And again, I've seen no end of applications where people say that, for example, that they talk about the structure and they make comments such as, if we repair this integral structural beam as part of the application, then it can be converted. We don't want to be doing that. We want to be able to robustly demonstrate that this existing building is capable of conversion without really any structural alterations. So what I would say is that you are allowed to undertake internal repair work to a building at any time. And so that, as Sally said, lining your ducks up, get a structural survey out. You know, we would also have a pretty good idea as well now. Look at those points. How is this building going to be converted? What physical operations have to happen in order for it to convert? And is the existing building going to be able to take that? You need to be really confident on this point before you submit your application, because again, you can't undo that once you have said something needs repairing. So so look at that carefully, and a very large proportion of appeals relate to this point about the structure. There's a couple of little quirks that we've come across. So natural light. I hold my hands up. This was one that I got wrong. Was fortunately it's one of my own applications. Was what there were some very thin wispy trees that had been planted up the side of one shed, and we'd put windows in the top floor of it, and it was refused on the basis that those trees eventually would grow up and would inhibit the natural light into those habitable rooms. So had we just cut those trees down, I mean, they weren't even trees, they were like big twigs really. Had we cut those down before the application, that wouldn't have been an issue. So we just cut them down afterwards and applied again. So a few little things that have come up. And one of the new criteria under the new rules is that it needs to have existing access. So occasionally we do new planning permissions for new agricultural accesses before we do class Qs. So sometimes it's about getting your, thinking of that strategy. Does it have an existing access? If not, well, your existing agricultural building probably needs an access. So we do that first before we think about the class Q. So moving on to how to present your application. There's a few elements to this, couple of slides. Your drawings. So in theory, you could do it yourself, but I really would get an architect to do it, because there are things that you have to get right in it. And again, coming back to the objective criteria, the rooms and the internal design has to meet technical housing standards. So that includes things like certain space specifications and allowances. We have to be able to show that there is natural light to all habitable rooms. So that is kitchen, dining, living, bedrooms. You don't have to have natural light to a pantry or a storage room or a utility. So again, don't let it fail on sort of technical things. If you need to call a room in the middle that you can't get natural light to, just call it a storage room. Just don't call it a bedroom. Total area, obviously, as Sally said, you've got to be able to stick below the 150 square meters for each one. Be aware of the difference between internal and external gross areas. You'll be aware, or you might be aware, that the curtilage size is no bigger than the existing footprint of the building. So that is external footprint. And there's a few little clever tricks that you can do, which about sort of shading your access a different color and different things sometimes if you want to try and keep that area out of your 150. Design, we have to sort of run or try to tread quite a careful line here on design, because obviously you want it to try, especially if you're actually going to build out the class Q, you want it to look nice. Most local authorities still want it to look agricultural, which means that they don't want huge amounts of new glazing. So you've got to sort of have a moderate amount or moderate volume of glazing. And even though you are now allowed to have these protrusions of up to 200 mil, where in theory you could overclad a building, there is also a thin line to tread about lots of new material. So coming back to this point about is it a conversion or a rebuild? It might well be fine to say that you're going to replace some wall cladding or some roof cladding and inserting windows and doors, but you don't want to be doing all of it. So even though technically the Class Q legislation says you can install windows, doors, roofs, windows, you can't do all of it at once. So again, strategy and just making sure that you understand that. And of course, on a technicality in terms of your drawings, if you want to utilize the extension or protrusion benefit, then you've got to make sure your measurements are correct. You don't want it to be failing because you've made that slightly too big. How to present your application. This is what we do. Others will potentially do things differently. So what you must submit is a structural survey, in our opinion. That is a survey by a structural surveyor or an engineer to say that your building is structurally sound, it is capable of taking the loading that will be required of it in the conversion. And again, I know that it sounds really obvious, but read your structural survey. Does it say the right things? We've seen applications just submitted without reading, and a structural surveyor that wasn't familiar with Class Q has just said the wrong thing in it. can't undo that. So, it sounds obvious, but it's happened. We always submit a planning statement, and that is basically, we do it in a sort of tabular form where it covers all the legislative criteria in a clear, concise format that you're trying to make the planning officer's job easy. The whole purpose of this is that a planning officer is a planning officer. They are not a structural surveyor, they're not an architect, and they're not a builder. And so you have got to be able to, as clearly and robustly as you possibly can, talk them through, guide them through, and show them why they should approve your application and why it meets the Class Q. Don't leave anything to their imagination, because if they're not familiar or they're not particularly pro Class Qs, they're not going to be approving that, so you've got to be backing them into a corner where they've got no reasons for refusal. So your planning statement covers half of that. And then what we do is something called a construction method statement. And we, going back to that point, we talk the planning officer through all the building operations that have got to happen to that building and how they meet the Class Q criteria. So again, I think that's just giving it a level of robustness that, perhaps if you don't know about it, you might not automatically do that. There's a few other documents that you might need, those being an ecological survey, a transport statement, flood risk assessment if you're in a flood zone. Sometimes we come across it where the use is a little bit ambiguous. I've got an example at the moment where it was an agricultural building, or it still is an agricultural building. It's had two other planning applications, sort of 20 years ago, 5 years ago, for light industrial use and then some other random use. Neither of those were ever implemented, but because those are the last two applications, we're doing a statutory declaration from the owner to say, yes, I got permission for those. I never implemented them. They've never been used for those uses. The lawful use is therefore still agricultural. And again, it's just about backing the planning officer into, okay, well, I'm not going to dispute that because I've got the information here in front of me. And if your site is under a tenancy, you might have to get a tenant consent letter. So just very quickly, you've got your Class Q. What next? Your first question is it what you want? And if it is, that's great. You've just got to be aware that, as Sally said, you've got to build it out within and complete it within 3 years. And you've got to be just careful about building it as per the plans. If it is pretty close to what you want, you can make certain amendments through something called a Section 73, but it still has to meet the Class Q legislation within that. If it isn't quite what you want and the amendments go beyond the Class Q criteria, then we can make a full application. This is one, for example, sorry, it's behind it. It was a tin shed and we got the Class Q on it, and then the developer, the owner, wanted to actually change the materials. So we actually were keeping the steel frame building underneath it, but he wanted to take all the tin off and replace it with these materials. So we did a full application to replace the Class Q. If you have basically just got permission for something with a view to banking it and getting a sort of fallback position, then we can go for what we call the Class Q supersede. And this is where we get, so you've banked your Class Q, you've got permission for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 residential dwellings in a certain location. What we can do under certain circumstances is then go back to the planners and say, okay, well, we've got that. Actually, it looks fine, doesn't look that exciting. Please, can we have permission for some nice new builds instead? Now, whether those new builds are very similar or quite different depends on its own merits. But this is an example that Sally recently did. This was actually under the old rules where we got permission for one big one rather than several small ones. So you'll see the barns up to the top left, got permission for a big Class Q, bottom right. And then Sally, I'm sorry that is covering it up. Sally has then, this one, I'm not sure it's actually been approved yet, but I think we've had sort of indications from the planning officer that it'll be okay. This one is what he wants to build instead. And we got the fallback position through the Class Q, then followed it up with this for a brand new build in the same location, same footprint or similar footprint, but as you'll see, a far superior design. This is another one where we have got banked to Class Q and we're going back in for 3 new builds. This will be sold as plots to a developer. So again, going back to the objective, what are we trying to get out of it? I think that is me. So thanks for listening. I think Angela hopefully is going to come on next. Angela has had a power cut this morning, which is really unhelpful. So it might be Angela, or it might be back to Sally.
Right, thank you, Hannah. That was brilliant. I'm just going to, Angela looks like she's there and able. So Angela, I've popped it over, so you should be able to share your screen now. Just while Angela's doing that, just to say, if people have, we're going to have a little QA session after we've heard from Angela. So if people have any questions, it would be great if you can put them on the, I think there's a chat button. I can see there's a couple come through already. So if you've got some questions, you could start popping those on now. That would be brilliant. Thank you. You ready, Ange?
Thanks, Hannah. Thanks, Hannah. Thanks, Sal. Thanks, Nicola. I feel like I've got an easy gig today. I'm just going to whiz you through some example class Qs that we've been working on recently. So yeah, whistle-stop tour, some sites. With some images of sites that we dealt with across England, and also then I'll run through some real life examples, taking you through the good, the bad and the ugly of class Qs. So just quickly, I won't dwell too much, but I'm just going to whiz through some images of some various buildings and sites that we've been involved in. As I say, these are sites across England, and every building really is so different in terms of its position, and importantly its construction. So ranging from the timber poultry building that you've seen there, various storage buildings. Some of these have cropped up in the presentation previously, but some timber clad, some sort of round roof buildings, steel portal frames, which all look pretty robust and structurally sound. Cattle buildings, and this one in fact already has a first floor in it ready to go. So really this just gives you a little bit of a flavour of what things we come across, what buildings we come across, what types of sites we come across, and really the difference, just such a variety of buildings. So really, you know, do have a have a good idea of how your building or your site can comply with the magic criteria that we've already spoken about, or how they might qualify with a bit of strategic thinking. I think that's always the main point here. You will take away that probably from our presentation. That's where there's a will, there's a way. So I am going to run through the good, bad and the ugly, but of course I'm going to do it back to front because, well, why not? So we're going to start with the ugly. This project was a nice local one for us. It was in Worcestershire, a steel portal frame cattle shed with a cantilever. As you can see from the picture here on the right hand side, there was some nice new timber cladding. The client had added this cladding on the advice of his previous architect. So he did this work before submitting the Class Q application. So in doing that, there was two risks really here. One, that the works had already been done, and this could be considered as being agricultural permitted development, and therefore if you've already utilised your agricultural PD, before you go in for your Class Q, this can potentially extinguish your Class Q rights. The second risk really is that the works undertaken can be viewed by the council as commencement of the Class Q works or the Class Q conversion. So as a Class Q is a prior approval process, you're basically asking the council, you're telling us what you're proposing to do, and they confirm whether it complies with the criteria before you make a start. So this must be determined before development starts, and of course if the council concludes that the works have already started, they may refuse an application, and on the basis that it's no longer a valid prior notification submission. So the application was duly submitted, and lo and behold, it was refused. The planning officer took the second option, so it considered not to be a valid Class Q application on the basis that the works had already been undertaken. Once we got involved and after the refusal came through, the client approached us to see if we could throw this project a bit of a lifeline. And this is what it looked like afterwards. After we'd advised the client to perhaps he might like to remove the cladding from the building, so to put it back to a state that it was originally in. Not only had he had all the sort of the cost of doing that and the time of doing that work, what he found more painful was that he'd already spent money on advice, which told him to do the works, which resulted in a refusal. So I think sometimes that we just need to find a workaround, and there nearly always will be a workaround. Yeah, and hey presto, the timber was removed, the planning application was submitted, and it was eventually approved under Class Q. Happy days. So we move on then to the bad. Obviously, we're going into reverse order. So this was a tricky existing planning application, planning permission. So it already had, this was a steel portal frame building in Yorkshire. This building already had planning permission. You would have thought this was going to be straightforward, but on closer inspection, the main issue here was that the original planning permission had a condition that restricted the use of the building to agriculture only, and this trumps all subsequent permitted development applications, including Class Q. So we needed to explore how to navigate around this. It became apparent that the building hadn't been built in the right place. The client didn't know it by building it in the wrong place. It unlocked the condition, and I will explain why on the next slide. So we found that the building was built around 6 meters away from where it should have been built. The building was also completed in 2014, so it had been in place for 10 years, which meant by the passage of time, the building had become lawful. So we submitted a lawful development certificate to regularise the building that was actually built. And this meant that the original condition attached to the planning consent was effectively fell away and was no longer applicable. So the Class Q on the lawful building then ended up with something like this. So a really, substantial 4-bedroom house. So moving on to the good. This is a pretty textbook Class Q conversion. This barn was in Leicestershire. Straightforward Class Q, generally ticked all the boxes. Modern steel portal frame building, and almost all sides were enclosed. And it was structurally sound, needing very little works and no external alterations apart from those which were necessary to allow it to function as a dwelling, like doors and windows, for instance. So you can see that the existing openings incorporated some glazing as well as some additional walls, but these were minimal to make the layout work as a dwelling. We submitted an application, and this is how it ended up. This really was a true conversion. And this prior approval was granted, and the project really embraced the essence of the Class Q by reusing a redundant agricultural building as a dwelling through conversion. And whilst we're on the subject of conversion, this is the type of thing that is often needed to show a planning officer, for instance, just how much of the building is being retained. So it really is about retention versus addition. So the orange sections here are the existing elements of the building, so walls, external walls and internal walls, those showing the parts which are being retained in the proposed conversion. The blue element are new walls on the external front-facing elevation of the building. Appeals history tells us that the most successful cases are where around the majority of the materials that are retained, and this is generally sort of rule of thumb around 75% of the fabric of the building being retained, and I think it was slightly more on this case, so the more the better. It's it's really important to show retention versus addition to show a true conversion, and this is obviously subjective, as we've discussed, and very much open to interpretation by the planning officer. So it's just important to show that there is no doubt and just reduce the risk of refusal, as Hannah already cited. Good to back the planning officer into a corner, so the facts are indisputable. So as in the good, the bad and the ugly, not all class Qs are equal. The best and most successful cases are generally those that a genuine agricultural building is where it's capable of conversion with relatively modest intervention. The more the project drifts towards reconstruction or with lots of additions, the more likely it is to move from the good through to the bad, ultimately into ugly territory and even refusal. So not all is lost. If you have a tricky site or building, feel free to come and talk to us and see whether we can help you with your project and get it on the right side of good before you start out on your journey. Thank you, and that's me. Those are just a few examples that we've been involved in recently. It's just a little bit of food for thought. That's great, thank you. That's me done.
Thank you, Angela, and well done for getting yourself into an internet position after your power cut this morning. Great, so we have, as you can imagine, quite a lot of questions to get through. We probably won't get to them all, but just to let everybody know that if we don't get to you, we will have them and I will be able to contact you. So we will definitely get in touch with you. So just the first one. So if you bank the class Q and tweak it later, does this extend the 3-year period? So I think, Hannah, you sort of covered this briefly in your presentation.
It does depend how we tweak it. So if we tweak it through a section 73, potentially, if we change it to a full application, then it would change it altogether. So we're basically changing it from a class Q to a full application at that point. And at that point, you just got to start it within 3 years.
Yeah. Okay. I think I know the answer to this one, but can an equestrian building benefit from class Q? So that's a no, unless it's part of a farm, an active farm. Is that right? Yeah. And then another one I know the answer to. So class Q, does it exist in Wales? It doesn't, does it? There is no class Q in Wales.
No.
Okay. Should all LPAs allow new builds after the class Q has been achieved as a fallback position? So the answer is no, but you may want to just go into a bit more detail with that.
It depends, I suppose, what angle you're coming from. Should they? I don't know whether that's
yeah.
I think they should, yes. Some LPAs are a lot more receptive to it than others. That's definitely true. There are some local authorities around here where we probably do 7 or 8 out of 10. We do as follow-up applications afterwards. The one that Angela talked about, the one up in Yorkshire, that was the certificate, I'm now just doing a full application for that, and they really don't like it very much. We will get it, but we might have to go to appeal. So it does depend on the local authority. And it depends, of course, once you've moved to a full application, you've already got your class Q, you move to a full application, that is now purely on planning merit. So you've got to be able to demonstrate that it meets planning, the technical things like, design and, other things that come into it. So yeah, you are into planning merit territory then.
Okay. We've got another one. They're a not-for-profit and company, I would think, and looking to convert some barns to community use buildings, i.e. skills hubs, cafe, etc. Would this be relevant, and how would they sit re-class Q? And some of the barns have asbestos clad roof and sides. The buildings have been agricultural barns up until now. Sal?
So the question on that, it's whether they can convert the agricultural buildings into those community uses. Is that what you're asking?
I think the question is, yeah, if they're a not-for-profit rather than an agricultural business.
Okay.
And also there's asbestos involved.
So as a headline on it, the uses there, community work uses, that kind of thing, that's not eligible under Class Q. It might come under Class R, which is a separate area of permitted development, which we've not touched on at all today. But under Class Q, that's very specifically only to residential uses. As to whether the not-for-profit element, you know, if we assume for a moment that they were talking about residential, just to pick up on a couple of other of the points in there, the not-for-profit element may or may not make a difference depending on the rest of the background and current use of the buildings and history and all the rest of it. So that's something, if anybody else was in that position and looking at residential, there's kind of more to find out to know the answer on that one. And asbestos is another really tricky one. I believe, I mean, we've certainly done examples where asbestos in a building doesn't automatically make it unconvertible, depending on how you're going to use it and what you're going to do with it and whether you can kind of wrap it in something else or cover it without making holes in it. I think in most circumstances, most people would prefer to remove the asbestos and replace it with something else. And then that then comes into all of the points that Hannah in particular was talking about earlier as to the extent of building works and extent of materials that you're using. So it's kind of having asbestos isn't the be all and end all of a yes or no. It's what you're going to do with it that then comes into it.
Not forgetting, you know, they can just look at a planning application, of course.
Yes, yeah. So we have, that's just something to note. We've kept it fairly brief regarding full barn conversions because Class Q is such a big area, but that is always, you know, also an option. Okay, right. Bear with me a second.
I suppose just to add into there as well, building regulations still apply. So just because you get something through under Class Q, you've also then got to demonstrate as a completely separate system, but you've got to get it through your building regs as well further down the line. So that can kind of, depending on, like Hannah was saying earlier, your objectives, whether it is to live in or supersede it or whatever else, but asbestos or different materials and things might have more relevance further down the line.
Okay, so back to the question about equestrian. If the equestrian land is being used as equestrian stroke agricultural, for example, sheep farming and poultry, what impact does that have?
It depends on the lawful use. If it's still lawfully agricultural and looks, smells, feels like a farm, that might be okay. If they've ever had a change of use to equestrian, then there's no permitted development rights. The facts and merits of each case, Nicola, really.
Okay. So some of these, you know, as we said, we will, especially when they're quite detailed, we'll probably try and come back to you after the webinar because it's not always a straightforward answer, is it? No. Let's have a look. So for an agricultural building, Class Q application, is there a requirement to prove that the agricultural holding is financially viable?
That's a nice, easy question. No.
Okay.
Yeah, no, there is an element, depending on what the use of the building is and the qualifying criteria for the use, there might be an element of proving that there is an agricultural trade and that there is a business and there is some money trading hands, but there isn't an element of proving that it's profitable or viable.
Yeah. Okay. There's a question here. I think we're slightly confused between Class Q and Class R, but is there any chance you can put a new building for Class Q industrial, industrial let, so it might be separate, but this isn't what we're talking about with Class Q, is it? Class Q is the conversion of an existing agricultural barn
to residential. Yeah.
Unless
they mean industrial from kind of holiday let type perspective or letting from that perspective, in which case Class Q can come into that. But if you've got an existing agricultural building and you want to use it for commercial use, then Class R might apply, depending on the circumstances, which obviously we're not talking about today. Otherwise, full planning might come into it.
And then if this chap here is talking about building new agricultural buildings, that's something different. That's agricultural permitted development.
Yes.
Right. Okay. Yeah. I have a barn where the roof joists are damaged, with some being burnt and broken. The existing roof sheets are also damaged, with holes and sections that need replacing. I've obtained a structural engineer's report. Other than the roof structure and the roof covering, the report confirms the remainder of the building is structurally sound. Can I replace damaged roof joints and install new metal roof sheets before submitting a Class Q application?
It is a tricky question. If it's genuinely a repair of a relatively small area of the building that's been damaged, I would think that's probably fine, because at this point in time, they are repairing their agricultural building. You could park Class Q if he needs to, or they need to repair their agricultural building and it's replacing it like for like, and it's a relatively small area, then that's probably fine. If it is quite large amounts of the area, by surface area, you're starting to get into the remit of would they possibly need planning for that repair. I'm afraid there's no quantifiable answer. If somebody looks at it and genuinely that's a repair to your agricultural building, it's probably fine. If it looks like it's quite a big rebuild, or they are changing the nature of it, or the colour of it, or the material, that would need planning permission in itself. And It kind of goes back to Angela's example that if you were to do a lot of work without planning permission, you're then potentially scuppering your Class Q anyway because you've done other work. Is that fair, Sal, do you think?
Yeah, I'd agree with that. One thing which we haven't really talked about today, or it's part of, I mentioned that you can't cross over with agricultural permitted developments and Class Q permitted development. You have to be a bit careful with that example, that if you're making external changes, i.e. changing the roof sheets, you've got to be a bit careful that doesn't get classed as carrying out works under your agricultural permitted development, which actually then scupper your Class Q anyway. But even if you did need planning permission for it, that might actually be the safest route, to get planning permission to repair the roof, replace the roof materials with something else, and then you're not at risk of it being unlawful, you're not at risk of it being agricultural permitted development.
Okay. We're just coming back to this, the one about is it agricultural? So if the change of use to agricultural is recent, but the building has been in place for over 10 years, can the Class Q still come into place as the building has been used for storing hay and sheep?
Sorry, so what's that? That's an example of a new agricultural unit, but an existing agricultural
I think
building.
they're talking about changing the use to agricultural, but the barn has been used as agricultural, but probably not officially used as agricultural. It has to officially be agricultural, doesn't it?
There is time limits to watch out for on this. The legislation sets out what is considered an established agricultural unit, and it also sets out circumstances if you're creating an established agricultural unit after 2023. So it depends a little bit on the background and all the rest of it, but it's one of those examples where we'd say get some advice and check it out.
Contact
It
us.
might qualify it.
Yeah.
Don't take generic advice on that one.
Yeah. So this is a nice one. What happens if the project is not completed in the 3-year timescale and runs over?
It's hard to say. Quite possibly nothing would happen. And I've seen them. I've seen lots of people do it where it does run over, and in theory, the local authority don't know, nobody reports them, and they just carry on, finish building it in whatever timescale. But also, if you have got Doris down the road who's on your case and they happen to know that your 3 years is up and you haven't finished it, then you are absolutely in danger of it not meeting the legislation and being not compliant with the legislation. The short answer is don't get yourself into that position. If you are worried that you are going to not be able to meet your 3 years, you've got to swap it out to a full application or reapply for the Class Q. But I really wouldn't worry, especially if you think that anybody's going to be looking at it. I really wouldn't want to risk it. You either reapply for your Class Q, get a full planning application, and make sure that you add another 3 years on or something.
Yeah.
You don't want to be having that argument. It's solvable. There's ways around that. So don't get yourself into that position and don't give yourself that problem.
Yeah. And we'll just do one last one. So I think the question is, can you get Class Q approval on an agricultural building that is 10 years old, but that did not get planning approval when it was constructed 10 years ago? I think, Sal, you touched on this. You need to get a certificate of lawfulness first. Is that right?
Yeah, I think I covered that. Yeah. Yeah. So if the building has been in place and used for that purpose for continuously for that period of time, 10 years, then there is the potential for looking to formalise or regularise that to make it lawful before you then go apply for your Class Q. Okay,
great. Right. There's loads of questions, so we will try and afterwards try and contact everybody, you know, and we're here to help, but we just can't cover them all in this webinar. So I'll just
people have got, you know, have got a fairly far, you know, reasonably progressed with their project and actually want specific advice on there, you know, we're quite happy to do our free consultations, aren't we? You know, just pick up the phone and Sally or Andrew, I can chat to them.
Yeah, so I'll just finish off with just how to contact us, if that's okay with everybody. So this is, can you see my screen now? Yeah. So if you need assistance, as Hannah just mentioned, with a planning project, then we do offer a free initial chat with an experienced planning consultant. The person to speak to is call our office. This is Jess. Most of the time you'll get Jess. You might get me, you might get Becca, but you normally get Jess, who can help you, and she'll ask you a few questions about your project, and then she'll book you in with the right person to speak to. Here are our contact details. So obviously there's many ways to contact us. Call, email. Our website is a brilliant place for some initial information on your project. It's well worth a look. We're active on social media. We have a YouTube channel which has things like this webinar on it, and it's a really good place to start if you're after some information on planning for your project. So that's us. You can tell Class Q is a big planning area for us. You know, we're working on between 5 and 10 Class Q applications at any one time, right across England. So please do get in touch and see if we can help you. So thank you very much for joining our webinar. Thank you to Hannah, Sally and Angela, who's managed to stay despite her drama this morning. And we hope you've enjoyed it. And as you can see, we're a friendly bunch. Get in touch and see if we can help you. Thank you.
Bye.
Cool. Bye.